welcome back to another daily cribbage. It's time for the final AI challenge. This is against the impossible AI. So far, we have been doing well against all the AIs and we haven't really faced anything too difficult yet. Now, my record against the impossible AI is fairly 50-50. So let's see if we can do something today. Let's try and explain everything, and if we get lucky, we'll win. And if we don't, then we don't. So, what are we starting off with? We're starting off as the dealer, which is a really good sign. So, in general, against someone of maybe a similar strength as the dealer, you would expect to win around 60%, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less of the time. So already looking good for us. And when we look at our hand as well, we've got quite a few nice options. So we've got a 5, 6, 7 as a run. We've got a pair of kings and the 2, which actually combos quite well. 2, 6, 7 is 15. So what do we want to keep in this hand? Well, one thing that we could do is we could keep 2, 5, 6, 7, discard the kings. And what's that doing? Well, it's giving our hand 5 points, our crib 2 points, and allowing us to improve to double runs with an extra 5, 6, 7, or a longer run with a 4 or 8. And each of the ways that this improves to a longer run is also giving us an extra 15. So really nice there. The other option is to keep 6 points in hand, keep a little bit more, throwing fewer points into the crib with the 6, 7. But the 6, 7 combos really nicely with other cards like 8s that our opponent might be throwing away. So it's a bit of a challenge here to work out what's better. I do like 6, 7 and King, King is fine. King, King has the downside that it doesn't combo with much in the crib. Our opponent would have to throw away something very specific like Jack Queen in order for something to combo with our pair of kings, and our opponent doesn't throw away Jack Queen into the crib very often. So, but in contrast though, by throwing away King King, we are getting a whole extra point. I think that on balance, well, I also want to think a little bit about how these hands play. 5, 6, 2, 5, 6, 7, 2, 5, King, King. They both play actually pretty fine. As the dealer, you don't have to worry so much about the play because you get to react to your opponent, and your opponent has to be the one who's worried about having all their cards be trapped. Oh, there is another discard here which I failed to mention, and that's the rare 5 King. So now instead of keeping 7 or 6 points, this is only keeping 4 points overall, 2, 6, 7, and 5 King, but it is putting a 5 into the crib, so it's somewhat worthy of note. But and I think that in general, when you're looking at this hand, you can narrow down your discard to one of those 3. Maybe, okay, unless you're in the end game. If you're at the right in the end game, then you would consider lots of other things. In this case, I'm just going to go with the 6, 7. Hopefully we improve a little bit in the crib. If not, it's no problem. We've got plenty of points in hand. Opponent leads a 3, we can either play the 2, but that leads to many 10s and we can't really react, or we could play the 5, but that opens us up for interesting runs with 4s, and I'm not really in the mood to start giving our opponent lots of points through run plays. So instead, I'm just going to play the king, and when our opponent goes to 15, I get to pair. And in this case, our opponent has the 4 for the 2, 3, 4 queen, which gives them 7 points overall. But that means that we're left with 5 king for 2 points at the end. So overall on the play, we don't actually get as much as we would necessarily like. The ratio is not so good here. 4 points for our opponent, 5 points for us, but it maintains our position. The computer likes the king. It's very greedy for that extra point. It doesn't want to have really big improving cribs at all. 6-7 in the crib does have a slightly higher average, but apparently not worth it. Overall, though, they're pretty close. The 5 king that I was talking about is very low down, mostly because the hand score is not too good. Okay. What's next? We've got 2, 4, 5, 10, king. We're at 13, we're looking to get to 18, and we see our way to get to 18. Now, if it was later on in the game, we might think about choosing a slightly safer discard than 2-4. 2-4 could be slightly dangerous because our opponent need only get a 3 in the crib for this to start be worth like 3 points for the run and maybe 2 points or 4 points for 15s with like 2, 3, 10 or 3, 4, 8. So you might consider throwing away something like 2-10. And why would you do this? Is because it keeps quite a lot of points in hand. 4-5 is connected in hand, so 3s and 6s are really good. But it also throws away cards that are fairly separated. 2-10 is I call it like a low-high combo. That's my terminology here. And the point is, with low-high combos, there are cards that will make them into 15s, but your opponent has to get quite lucky with those. Whereas if you go low, then there are lots of ways to make 15s in runs. In this case, though, it's very early on in the game, and the positional factors don't play as much of a role as they do later in the game. And the reason why that is because we are at a point where sort of averages are going to take effect or more often. So the point is that we're going to play more hands, and over the course of those hands, we're going to see the averages play out. So we're going to score a whole bunch of hands where we get below the average, and we'll get the occasional hand that's way above the average, positive skew style. So over the course of the next however many hands this game lasts, we're probably going to see a high scoring hand and lots of low scoring hands. That's the way it usually goes. So there's no reason to really try and stop our opponent from scoring a huge amount here. That's just part of the game, and we should just think about making our averages and getting ourselves into the most comfortable position. I think I sort of explained that poorly, but that is what I would consider important here. We get 5'd after we lead the king. It was noteworthy that we could lead the 5 ourselves. We see in front of us 3 5s, so pairing this 5 is somewhat safe. If we do get tripled, our opponent goes into a really good position, but that's okay. We can deal with that when we get there. Opponent does have a king, surprisingly. Opponent shows us king, double, queen, and then double 5, so also 16 points, just like us. And they have 6 points in the crib, so it's really good for our opponent, actually. High rolling. This is one of their high scoring hands. Trying to throw away, though, the 2 and the 10 wouldn't have done too much for us in terms of the crib. It wouldn't have made the crib much safer, as it turns out, because the 5 is always good for the dealer. There's I say. So here we've got 3, 4. Those go together. 9, 10, jack. Those are another clump, and we've got a king. So let's throw away the 3, 4 and keep the rest of the clumps. Our hand, it should be noted that our hand plays very poorly because we only have a 9 and 10s. So what's our goal here? Should we pair this 10? Are we desperate for points? Just like that? The answer is we would like points, but our opponent probably doesn't need points. They've shown us so far a 10, and a 10 isn't generally in a hand that is helped by the 6. The only kinds of hands that have 10 and the 6 is playing a big role are hands that have 9s in, so a double run through the 10 that contains 9s. We block some of those with our own 9, so it's looking quite good. Our opponent leads more 10s when they're doubled, but I don't think we have to worry too much about these things. I'm just going to pair this 10. Okay, where were we? Right, should we play the 10 or the king? What are we worried about? Our opponent's at 39 points. They're going to get a lot of points on this play if they have a hand that combos well with the 6 through 9s, double runs with 9s. Otherwise, it might be a good sign that a 6 has come up with the hands like 5 and a couple of 10s and maybe a low card. The 6 doesn't really interact with those. So let's avoid pairing the 10 and let's hope for something bad. Okay, so they had a 10 and a king. This might be a good start. We're going to go 9 here to avoid stuff. And they've got, so far they've shown us a 10, a queen, and a king. So it probably means they have a lot of jacks here. So we're going to keep our jack in order to try and pair it. They actually had a 5. So that's only 6 points, which is sort of the bare minimum with the 5 with lots of 10s kind of hand. We got 2 points in the crib, which is not too much, but can't complain. Let's move on now. So opponent's up to 48, which is quite strong, and we are at 43. Our hand doesn't really allow us to do too much. We are handcuffed into this 9-pointer. The second best is worth so little that it's not worth thinking about. And now we have a real choice. We can lead one of the 10s or we can lead the 5. The 5 is probably safer. And the reason is because if we lead the 5 and our opponent does not play a king, but does play one of the other 10s, we can pair that other 10. And we can effectively trade points. If our opponent has 6s or 5s, then there are other things our opponent can do there. So if our opponent plays, if we go 5, our opponent goes 10, we double their 10, they might be able to play 6 to get 31. If we lead 5 and our opponent pairs our 5, then that's quite bad for us, but it does mean that our opponent might be scared. Well, they're a computer, how could they be scared? A human might be scared of us tripling their 5, which would not only get us 6 points for the triple, but also 2 points for the 15. So in general, people would avoid pairing the 5 that's led. However, it could be the case that they would pair our 5. The thing that playing the 5 out first avoids is if we went 10 and our opponent goes 5 and we pair the 5, it avoids us being tripled. So it allows us to really take control of when we triple the 5. I like that quite a lot, so I'm going to lead the 5. Opponent plays 15 with the queen, so we will pair that. Opponent shows us 2 and shows us a pair of 2s. They haven't shown us 3, so I'd expect a 3. Opponent has more jacks than 10s, so we will do that. Opponent has 2, 2, 3, 3 for 12, taking them almost up to 70 points. And we have 12 points total this round, taking us to 55. What have we got here? We've got a 3 and then a run from 5 to 9. A thing to always look out for is this 6, 7, 8, 9 combo. Now this is actually quite a common occurrence because it doesn't involve any pairs. So whenever you see 6 to 9, you can think to yourself, this is worth 8 points straight away. And so you're comparing everything else in your hand to that. And in this case, we've got a flush, which is worth 4 points because it doesn't have anything else in it. It does improve a lot, so I think everything improves this flush. So it's going to be worth at least 6 points. For instance, if it's an ace that comes up, we've got ace 6 8. If it's 2 comes up, then we've got 2 5 8. If we've got a 7 that comes up, we've got a big run. If a 9 comes up, there's 6 9, and if any 10, then we've got 5 10. So everything improves this flush. But unfortunately, 6 points is nowhere close to the 8 points we're guaranteed, and it's also nothing compared to putting away 5 into the crib. It's always a nice thing to put 5s into the crib, because when we do that with higher frequency, it sort of discourages our opponent from always dumping their 10s into the crib, which don't combo with all of our other discards. Our opponent leads 7 here, and I think so. Our options are we can pair the 7 or we can play the 8. I think they're playing the 6 or the 9. Actually, playing the 9 is actually quite a good play some of the time if we are very worried about how our opponent is going to score. So 9 is probably the safest, followed by 7, and then 8 is probably the card that scores us the most on average. The reason why 8 is so good is because we have what I like to call we are surrounding our opponent. So we have both the 6 and the 9 that can go on the bottom end or the top end of the straight that's going to develop if our opponent continues to make the straight. So when we play our 8, our opponent could go 6 and then we could go 9. Our opponent will go 9 and then we will go 6. And the result is going to be that our opponent's going to net 3 points and we will have net 2 points for the 15 and 4 points for the run, so 6 points. So we would be up 3 points. That's generally how you would consider it in a vacuum. And by in a vacuum, I mean if you weren't considering the scores. But in this case, we're considering the scores, we're considering the position, and we notice our opponent is 1 point away from their positional milestone, and so we might consider playing the 9. What does the 9 do here? Well, it means if our opponent has an 8, then they might play it to get 3 points, but they know that if they play that, then they're opening themselves up for us to play the 6. Which is going to give us 4 points. So we're going to trade a little bit, and for their 3 points, we're going to get 4 points, at least. And this is safer than other things, because if our opponent has a run which involves like 7, 6, 5, and doesn't have any 8s in their hand, or they have combos that don't have an 8 somehow, maybe they've got 7 7 ace or something like this, then they can't do anything about us playing a 9 here. So in that sense, the 9 is a very safe card. I think I like playing safe here. But one last thing to think about before we do this is what's our score. We've talked about our opponent being very close to their milestone. We are at 57. We are significantly behind. So this would make us sort of want to catch up and play the 8. We've got 8 points in hand. We've thrown a 5 into the crib. So we're guaranteed at least 10 points here. We are probably going to get a couple more points on the play. We could guarantee those points now with the 7, but allowing our opponent to triple our 7 is not particularly fun. So I'm going to play this 9, and our opponent goes 2. So this means that our opponent is either locked into a flush or they're holding a 7, 7, 2, 6 kind of hand. So 6 points. That means that we want to probably avoid playing the 6 because they can double us. And I will play the 8, taking us to 26. And hopefully they don't have the 5. No, so they've got 7s plus. And they've shown us a 10 of hearts. And this fills us with a great deal of hope, because it means that our opponent doesn't have a very high scoring hand. They've shown us 2, 7, 10, not flush. They could have a 9. That would give them a 3-point run. But that would have been a very bad discard for them, keeping 2, 7, 9, 10. I think it's, and they don't have an 8, because I suspect that they would have played the run of 3. What's the last card here? This is very interesting. I think there's most likely a 6 or a 7. I think they have slightly more 6s than 7s because of removal, because we've already seen a 7. So I think I'll play my 7 here and be sad when they double it. Nope, they have the 6. I think they do have more 6s than 7s. So we get to bear it. Our opponent had only 2 points in hand, which is actually fantastic news. We're now catching up, and if our opponent slows down, we're going to be ready to pounce. This is the first thing that I recognize in this hand is ace 4, 5, 10. So I put the ace 4 together to make 5. I've got a 5, and I also have a 10 card. And now I'm looking at the other 2 cards to see whether or not these are things I want to discard. In this case, 2, 7, it's a fairly reasonable discard. And the one thing to look out for is whether or not you can discard one of those cards with the 10. In this case, 7, 10 would be the safest discard, but it just doesn't keep any points in hand. And 2, 7 is not significantly worse for us than 7, 10. So we'll go 2, 7 there. The nice thing about ace 4, 5 is that it frequently improves a lot when we cut to 10. So in this case, we're up to 8 points. Great. We have a couple of options here now for the play. One option is to play out an ace or a 4. And this is with the hope that if our opponent plays a 10, then we can get 15. The other option is that we can play our 10. And the point is that if our opponent goes to 15 with a 5, then we can pair the 5. And if our opponent then goes to 30, we can play the ace for 31. So effectively, we're using our 3-card magic 16 in the 10, 5 ace. We could try and do the best of both worlds, and the best of both worlds approach is to play the ace first. If we play the ace first, then we're saying that if our opponent plays a 10, we now have an option. We can either play the 4 to get 15, or we could play the 5 so that if our opponent pairs our 5, then we can go to 31 with the 10. Unfortunately, leading the ace means that your opponent can just pair your ace, but if you balance your range correctly, your leading range correctly, then your opponent might be very scared about you tripling aces. So often if you have two aces, you might want to play one of them at the beginning, and then your opponent can't pair it because otherwise you're going to triple them. I don't have a very... So in general, my leading range tends towards avoiding leading an ace because... or this is in general. Towards the end of the game, it changes a little bit, but I think steering away from leading an ace is good because if you have a pair of aces, you can usually extract a bit more value from the play by keeping them for later. So here I'm going to leave my 10 and go for the magic, the 3-card magic 16. But now our opponent's thrown a spanner in the works. They've played 2, take us up to 22. And I have an option. I can either play the ace or the 4. So we can think, what does the 2 symbolize in our opponent's hand? What does it signify that they have? Well, one option is that they have 2, 5, 8. And if they have 2, 5, 8, then we would want to avoid playing the ace, because that would leave us on 23. The other thing it could signify is 2, 3, 10, and 5, 10. So our opponent could have 2, 3, 5, 10, which would also be pretty standard. And if they have 2, 3, 5, 10, then it doesn't matter whether we play the ace or the 4. Our opponent's going to get to play their 3 for a run, and then we play our ace. Then we play our other card and get a 5-card run. In this case, actually, it does make a slight difference, because if we play the 4 first, then our opponent gets 4 points for their run. But if we play the ace first, they get 3 points. So that's a slight difference. But if they do have so that's the question. They have more 8s than they have aces, or than they have 3s. And I think they do have quite a lot of 8s here. So I'm going to avoid that, and I'm going to play the 4. One thing to remember, though, is what we discarded, and that can be a tricky thing to remember when you're in a high-pressure situation on the play. We discarded 2, 7. So in this case, it doesn't... What does that mean for our opponent's hand? It might mean that they've comboed their 2... It might mean that they have comboed the 8 in their hand with a 2 and a 5 instead of a 7. So I'm just going to play out the 4. They do have the 3 for run of 4. And we play our ace for the run of 5 and get last card. Okay. So technically we lost a point there over what we could have done. But in the grand scheme of things, I was quite scared of the 8, or the pair of 8s. Our opponent threw away 6, 8, which is sort of the counter to throwing away 2, 7. And so they got a really nice 7-point crib. They got a very reasonable 8-point hand, and they got a huge 7 points on the play. Our opponent's back to doing very well here. 93 points, plays 92. What have we got here? We've got, again, ace 4 and a 5, and we've got 3 10s this time. So the maximum number of points we can keep in hand is 9 with the 5, Jack, Queen, King. And we can throw away ace 4, and it's always good to throw away 5s to some extent. The next best discard from ace 4 would probably be 5, Jack, but that's not very good because we're breaking up our run. We are only keeping 6 points total. I like the ace 4. Okay, this is huge. We've got a 17-point hand, excuse me, now. We have the right Jack, and we've also secured at least 2 points in the crib. So we know in our head now, we are sort of counting ourselves up by 19 points. And what does that put us on? Well, an extra 19 points is going to put us on 111, which means that we're going to be ready to go out next round as Pwn. We just want to score a few more points to make that easier, because scoring 10 points on demand is quite tricky as Pwn. So how do we do that? Well, our opponents led an ace. They have no fear of us doubling their ace, and if they have a pair of aces, they don't want to extract value from it later. I think that we're just going to make it up to 11. We're going to avoid playing the 5 now. We're going to keep that for later. So we'll play the king, because our opponent has fewer kings. Opponent shown us ace 6. So the hands that we have in mind at this point, things like ace 6 8, ace 6 7 2, or ace 6 7 8, those kinds of things. Overall, those don't really combo with our remaining hand, so as long as we don't play the 5 now, we're okay. They've shown us double ace 6, so we put our opponent on an 8. I guess they could have maybe a 7 a small percentage of the time. I'm going to say around 10 to 15% of the time it's a 7, like at least 60% of the time it's an 8, and the rest of the time it is some other nonsense. Maybe another 6, slightly more than the others, maybe a 5 as well. But yeah, it's an 8. So 6 points takes our opponent to the milestone, but we get a fantastic crib. So I said at a minimum we were looking at 19 points, but actually our crib was a lot better than we hoped for. Our opponent is already saying well played, and maybe they already know that we have these 3 points in hand. We definitely want to keep these 3 points. What's the only problem? There is no real problem here. Our opponent is almost certainly not able to peg 20 points, 21 points, sorry, or 19 points if a jack comes up. Is there anything to really consider? Is an ace better than 2, or a 7 better than ace or a 2? I think we want to keep a low card. I'm going to keep the 2, and we'll play a 9, because if our opponent has a 6, then, or our opponent has fewer 6s because we've seen a 6 on top, I'm going to offload our jack here, get rid of this 10, and there's no way for our opponent to score the requisite number of points. They are scoring a lot of points off us here, but we don't really mind. Okay, and that was a turbulent game, but we got there in the end. That was our game against the impossible AI. Overall, we are down a couple of points on the play. We did take some slightly risky lines, and we did manage, and at the end we lost quite a few points on the play, but we had already won at that point. We got a little bit lucky in hand. We got some big hands at critical moments, especially towards the end, and the cribs were identical. So that's our little mini series against the AIs. I've got some future ideas for what we're going to be doing next week. I might explain those closer to the time, but until then, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.